just want to be clear to all the people in America, the 30 million plus, who are having problems making rent, having problems buying groceries, who in just 2 days, come Saturday, are going to be in a position where, based on what they tell me, they're telling their kids, hey, you probably have to eat a little bit less because the unemployment is ending. And the fact is, the other body passed a bill so that folks would be able to make rent and buy groceries. On this side of the aisle, the Democratic leader and I introduced legislation to tie the benefits to economic conditions on the ground. One of the reasons we did is colleagues on the other side said benefits ought to taper off if unemployment goes down. That's what our bill does. But here's the message that I think folks who are walking on an economic tightrope this weekend need to hear. On this side of the aisle, we've been ready to go for weeks, essentially months, to have bipartisan negotiations to work this issue out. As of this afternoon, with benefits expiring in 2 days, the other side of the aisle has no piece of legislation on offer. Let me repeat that. No piece of legislation on offer. On this side of the aisle, they write lots of bills to help multinational corporations. Lots of bills to help the powerful and the special interests. But as of this afternoon, there is not a bill to help those folks who this weekend are going to be saying, we're not going to be able to make rent in a few days. We're not going to be able to feed our families. We're not going to be able to pay for the car insurance. People aren't spending this money on luxuries. They're spending it on essentials. To a great extent, they've kept the economy afloat for the last few months. Mr. President, the other point I want to make is that this did not have to happen. Not only do we have legislation ready to discuss with our colleagues that incorporates some of their ideas, we have been reaching out again and again, and yet Mitch McConnell, who took all of July off when he could have been getting this piece of legislation together, those big 2 weeks, and he could have been getting the legislation together, basically actively, didn't happen by osmosis, actively gave short shrift to the needs of the unemployed and made no effort, none whatever, even though we reached out continually to Republicans saying that this weekend, and the pain that working families have this weekend didn't have to happen, and we wanted to do everything we can, working with our colleagues, to prevent it. Now, for purposes of this discussion, I want to make sure people understand what this discussion really means to working families in this country. I was out at home with food banks and the like, lines for blocks, Mr. President. People who had never needed to go to a pantry or a food program were waiting in line because they've been hit by this economic wrecking ball. There are people who are worried about losing their home and losing their cars, being unable to fill their prescriptions. And as I mentioned, think about what it means when you have to tell your kid you ought to eat less because they don't know whether they'll have enough cash to stock the pantry next month. And as I said, Republicans' response to this over the last few days, last few weeks, I went to school on a basketball scholarship, and I remember when you could basically play stall ball, go into four corners offense, basically run down the clock, and then at the end, as my distinguished colleague from Wyoming tried to do, is say, well, it's the fault of the poor people. It's the fault of those, poor people. And I'm going to touch on what this really is all about. Now, Mr. President, when we began the negotiations, and I was the point person for the Democrats, in the finance room, I offered basic wage replacement as our position for dealing with this issue. Secretary of Labor Scalia said, can't be done. The states can't administer it. Western civilization is pretty much going to end if we try to do this. And then he folded his arms and for days basically refused to negotiate about alternatives. So understand that we started with the approach of basic wage replacement. Secretary Scalia said can't be done. States are stuck with old technology. I didn't disagree with that. Gave $1 billion to the states to help them update technology too. But I said, we're not going to tell those workers, Mr. Scalia, we're not going to tell those workers to pound sand. So I basically said we're going to average the benefit. $600. Some people are going to get a bit more than they would. Some people are going to get a bit less. But families are going to have a chance based on what the state employment offices told us to actually get benefits. Now, I know that it hadn't worked out too well in the state of Florida. President of the Senate, and I'm sure he'll want to talk about this in the debate, but at least millions of people in this country got a chance to make rent, buy groceries, pay medicine, because we said we're going to take a sum of money that the states told us they could actually, for the most part, administer. Now, the Finance Committee held a hearing on unemployment insurance this summer. And I particularly wanted to know how we might look at administering these benefits in the future, because I knew that we would all want to hear if there have been reforms and what the case might be for changes. During that hearing, just a few weeks ago, the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, the experts on this issue, on how the benefits are to be administered, said that, their words, any reduction or change in benefits will absolutely lead to a lapse in benefits. Now, you would think colleagues on the other side would say, my goodness, we don't want that to happen. These state workforce agencies said that there'd be a lapse in benefits no matter what you cut the amount, $100, whatever the amount was, there'd be a lapse in benefits. The gap in benefits could last a week or two, potentially up to a month. Well, I've been pointing out to senators you can't eat retroactivity. And yet everything I've heard about what colleagues want to do now, remember, they don't have a bill. They do not have a bill. They're taking the weekend off. We've got a bill on this side. Democratic leader, myself, supported by our caucus, we've got a bill. We're ready to talk. They don't have a bill to do anything for those people who are going to be hurting this weekend. But after that hearing, you would have thought people, Republican senators on the other side would say, you know, we've got to figure out what to do. We got to make sure that people aren't going to fall between the cracks through no fault of their own. Remember, so many of them are at home because government policies, quarantine. And of course, pattern is particularly ominous now because folks who were furloughed at the beginning then got brought back, and now with the spike, they're getting laid off again. But there you have it. The Association of State Workforce Agencies says that any change can lead to a lapse in benefits. And I guess my colleagues on the other side walked out of there and said, no big deal. It's just a few weeks. Well, tell that to the people who aren't going to have enough money to make rent and buy groceries next week. Tell that to their face, rather than just leave town and say, we'll talk about it another time and we'll see about 2, 3, 4 weeks and what people are going to have to do without this lifeline. I believe is going to be a disaster. The lapse that is being forced on this country right now is because Senate Republicans would not step up at any kind of step along the way. After the hearing, during the July break, they did not step up. The lapse is going to lead to evictions. It's going to lead to hunger. It's going to lead to desperation for millions of Americans. And the only way to avoid it is by acting now, by passing the American Workforce Rescue Act that Senator Schumer and I introduced. We just tried to pass it. If our bill had passed, the people who are going to be hurting this weekend, who aren't going to be able to make rent and aren't going to be able to buy groceries, would have some sense of security. They would be able to go to bed at night this weekend had our bill passed, knowing that there would be an opportunity to work with the other body and get this resolved and get it resolved quickly. Now those people know one thing, and that is that they better plan for yet more uncertainty and more pain. As my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say, well, maybe it'll get worked out in a few weeks, even though what they're talking about working out, and remember, there is no bill. We've never seen a piece of paper, but they're talking about cutting the lifeline over 50%. That's their proposal, cutting it more than 50%. Now, at a minimum, I believe that what the Republicans are now looking at is some kind of approach that after Secretary Scalia has told the Senate that the states can't do full wage replacement for individual workers, that they're not capable of doing it, the technology's too old, it can't get the math, it can't get individually tailored benefits out in a timely way. Apparently, my colleagues are using that model for their so-called idea that they want to talk about. Now, I've already mentioned the fact that they believe the argument for this is that it could be done in a few weeks. People are going to be hurting for those few weeks. Nobody has an answer to that. But everybody ought to understand that I was the first one to offer full wage replacement, I would say, to the President of the Senate. And it was Secretary Scalia who said that it couldn't be administered and has never changed his mind on that point. So my view is that proposals that add a whole lot of complexity to the unemployment system is a proposal designed to fail. And that apparently is what Senate Republicans are talking about. So, at a minimum, this delay in the Senate is going to cause a lapse in benefits. On top of that, it's been reported that Republicans could attempt to cut the benefit by well over 50%. And I just ask, how can anybody look at the state of the country and how powerful people and special interests can be doing so well and then decide to cut the economic lifeline for working families by well over 50% when the country's in the middle of a pandemic, when there's 60 or 70,000 new COVID cases every day and climbing, when there are 800, 900, 1,000 COVID cases every day and climbing, when the number of new unemployment claims, which before this year had never crossed 700,000, has been 1.3 million or higher for 18 straight weeks. And in fact, the number of new claims went up this week for the first time since April, a sign that the recovery is going in reverse. And as I mentioned, what I'm hearing about at home are businesses that reopened in May and June and are laying off their workers for a second time. A third of Americans couldn't make their last rent payment. Parents who lost their jobs are wondering how they're going to feed their children. And I just say to my colleagues who may be following this is an unthinkable level of pain and suffering and uncertainty to needlessly inflict on 30 million Americans. And it's not just about those who've already lost work, it's about the millions of others who are worried that their pink slip might come in August or September or October. They need support too. And in fact, the papers are full of stories of small businesses closing, and Mr. President, closing permanently. And I expect that all of those people who are worried that they haven't been laid off yet, but a pink slip may be coming their way in August or September or October, can have a word or two for their senators who are able to find plenty of time to write bills to help multinational corporations, but can't find the time to stand up for unemployed folks who are hurting. Now, before I wrap up this afternoon, Mr. President, I want to touch on this argument that Republicans have been flogging away on for months now, that these unemployment benefits are way too generous, and somehow they're convinced that it makes sense to insult the American worker and say that all these workers are sitting around lazily at home instead of going back to work. That argument does not pass the smell test. And I'm going to be very specific about why that argument, trotted out again by my friend from Wyoming, is way off base. First of all, the same Republicans who celebrated the May and June job reports are now talking about how lazy workers are by refusing to go back to their jobs. You simply cannot have it both ways. Second, not one of my Republican colleagues has brought forward real evidence to suggest workers across the country are turning down work. These anecdotes just don't hold water. According to one recent analysis, more than 2/3 of workers were hired in June went back to jobs that paid less than supercharged unemployment benefits. Third, it's an insult to American workers to say they'd rather sit at home than to earn their pay at work. If any one of my Republican colleagues were to go out and meet the Oregonians I've spoken to and who've been furloughed or laid off during the pandemic, they'd hear from people who desperately want to go back to their jobs when it's safe, people who believe in the dignity of work, people who want to provide for their families, and it's an insult to call them lazy. And Mr. President, I just want to kind of inject a note of reality into this, because my Republican colleagues have been so fixated on this argument. I've talked to a lot of unemployed workers, And I've said, back east, the Senate Republicans say all unemployed folks are lazy and they don't want to work and all the rest. And so many of the unemployed look at me incredulous and they say, Ron, ask them how in the world have they come up with that completely wrong idea? And they usually say, if I'm given a choice between unemployment or the chance to have a job in the private economy, where I have a future, where I can build upward economic mobility, they usually say, Ron, tell those Republicans in Washington, D.C., it's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer. Of course I'm going to take the job that gives me an opportunity for a future, the chance to work in the private sector and climb the ladder of economic mobility. I'm going to take that every time, rather than unemployment that certainly has been uncertain. So that's my response to the off-base kind of argument presented by Senator Barrasso. And if Republicans want to go home this weekend and insult the work ethic of millions of Americans who believe in the dignity of work, that's their constitutional right. The country obviously is nowhere near the end of this pandemic. Businesses are going to keep closing, some temporarily, others permanently. We're looking at the worst unemployment crisis since the Great Depression. And the benefits we put together initially, the supercharged unemployment benefits, and I'm especially proud, Mr. President, that we said that the law, which really hadn't been updated since the 1930s, that we would modernize the law and allow gig workers and the self-employed and independent contractors and part-timers to be brought into the system. Those supercharged benefits that we negotiated in the Finance Committee room, which, by the way, were signed off by Secretary Mnuchin. This was not done in the dead of night with only one side going along with the effort. These were negotiated with Secretary Mnuchin, who actually endorsed it at a press conference. These supercharged unemployment benefits have been the one thing that has kept millions of families from being in a position where they couldn't feed their families, couldn't make rent, and literally facing the kind of despair, the kind of fear that has made, Mr. President, the number of requests for mental health services go through the stratosphere, because people are so worried, and this question of their economic future is just one reason. Supercharged unemployment benefits have helped keep the economy afloat, have helped prevent a true economic meltdown, and even with the lifeline, so many are barely hanging on. They fall behind bills. I mentioned the threat of hunger. My seatmate here just talked about how important it is to act on housing assistance. It would be a historic failure, morally and economically, to slash this lifeline that is so important to getting workers through a pandemic. The Democratic leader, Senator Schumer, and I listened carefully to all sides. We thought about the need, given the fact that there are predictions of high unemployment for some time to come. We said, let's come up with a dependable safety net that provides some measure of predictability with respect to how the government is going to approach these issues in the future. My colleagues have said that they want a system that has the benefits taper off as unemployment goes down. What the Democratic leader and I have proposed does exactly that. But when unemployment, I believe yesterday there was a story in the Washington Post, I think they were talking about unemployment 15%. When unemployment reaches those kinds of levels, and we saw that story, people waiting and waiting for hours. And in fact, Mr. President, I don't have the exact percentage. I think I'd ask unanimous consent to place that story about the unemployment calamity in Oklahoma into the record at this point.
Without objection.
So, I close by way of saying that I came to the floor some time ago to ask unanimous consent to make sure that this weekend, when millions of people are hurting, remember, Mr. President, the suffering starts in 2 days. It starts on Saturday. 2 days in Florida, in Oregon, in Wyoming, all over the country. And Mitch McConnell, his response was, let's take a break. We can take off. He didn't seem to see those hurting people in Kentucky. Maybe they'll have something to say to him this weekend. But I'll tell you, I think it's a big mistake for Senate Republicans to have frittered away weeks on end when we could have had a dialogue, when we could have talked about ideas. President of the Senate has talked to me since he's been here a number of times about health care. So I enjoy talking to my colleagues and working on ideas to try to find a way to address concerns and solve problems. There wasn't one single effort, not one, to pick up on any of the ideas that I've been discussing here. In fact, I tried to reach out to colleagues on the other side and said, I've heard you say repeatedly, benefits should taper down as the unemployment rate goes down. Well, that's the heart of our bill on this side. So the hurt and pain that working families are going to face this Saturday and Sunday, 2 days from now, did not have to happen. It didn't have to happen. Our side has a bill to work on. The other side, I gather, has some ideas. We've not seen a single piece of paper, but I know that all those people who are hurting, they can't eat retroactivity. They can't eat all the Republican theories about delay and haggling. I believe these working families deserve a whole lot better. They deserve some predictability and certainty that when they are hurting through no fault of their own, their government isn't going to turn its back on them and say, we don't care if your kids can't eat and you don't have a roof over your head. Our country's always been better than that. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.